Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Writing Support Center workshop. My name is Giselle, and today's topic is how to write essays about literature. As the title suggests, we will be talking about literary analysis essays and the components that go into that type of essay. Now, if you've taken a workshop with the Writing Support Center before, this message might be familiar with you, so please feel free to skip forward past this slide if you've already taken a workshop. If this is your first time, I do like to provide tips to help you get the most out of this workshop. The first tip I have is for you to download the worksheet. Now, wherever you access this workshop, whether it be on the PCC Writing Support Center Canvas shell or on your instructor's Canvas shell, there should be two versions of a worksheet there. You can download either the PDF or Word version. You do not need to download both. Please just download the one that works best for you. My other tip for you is to take your time. Since this is a recorded workshop, you can pause when you need to, and you will need to pause whenever we do activities. Uh, how, on the other hand, you can also rewind. So if there's anything that remains a little unclear, please feel free to review the video again. So for this workshop, as I mentioned in the beginning, we will be talking about literary analysis. So I will provide a definition of what that actually is. I'm also going to specify the different components of a literary analysis essay and what you need to write a strong essay. And you're also going to get some practice drafting a sentence that incorporates textual evidence, which is a key component of all literary analysis. Now, to begin, you might be asking, how do you begin writing an essay on literature? So, an essay on literature is typically called a literary analysis essay. And instead of having me explain, I want to show you this video so that you can get an understanding of what literary analysis is. So, I'm going to go ahead and play.
We often hear that studying literature involves finding a deeper meaning to a text. When writing about literary works, we're expected to mentally dive below the surface in order to come back up with big ideas. But you may find yourself looking at the flat page of a book, wondering how deep it can really go. How do we reach those ideas that turn into great essays? Well, there are two crucial thinking steps that can lead us in the right direction: practicing insight and acknowledging complexity. Insight is the ability to arrive at an intuitive understanding of a big idea using only small clues to get there. If you're practicing insight, you'll be able to use observations about character behavior to figure out their true emotions and motivations. Pay attention to little things because they add up to what is really meaningful. For example, if you consider a character like Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice, who openly declares his dislike for Miss Lizzie Bennet, you might at first assume he's just a mean guy. But using your powers of insight, you're noticing other smaller things. How Darcy's eyes linger on Lizzie's face and how he seems all flustered when she's around. Add to the mix your knowledge that Mr. Darcy is in a much higher social class than Lizzie, and your sense of insight should be telling you that there's something more here. In this case, it will tell you that Darcy's surface behavior is in conflict with his true feelings of attraction, because the difference in wealth between himself and Lizzie makes him feel that it'll never work. Thinking about all those small clues gives us insight about some of the big abstract ideas within the novel that we can approach in an essay. Appearances versus reality, the power of wealth and social stratification, and the unpredictable nature of love and attraction. Look at that, deeper meaning. The second step to a sophisticated analysis is acknowledging complexity. Let's face it, in both life and literature, situations are complicated due to social forces like relationships, moral codes, personal desires, and power structures. This means that there are, at any given time, multiple factors that shape what is true. In order to acknowledge complexity in your writing, refrain from making broad generalizations about a text or establishing quick, simple judgments about a character. Explore each facet of your subject carefully, and make sure to consider multiple influences on events. Explain the tension of multiple forces that create the story. For example, a basic analysis of Toni Morrison's Beloved, where the protagonist has killed her own child rather than allow her to grow up in slavery, might sound like this. Setha murdered her own daughter. This act was wrong and causes the ghost of the child to haunt her throughout the novel. These observations are simplistic. They don't acknowledge all the different forces that contribute to what the character has done. Try something like this instead. A culture of slavery disturbs the ability to determine what is morally right. Setha's past experiences with violence reinforce the fear she has for her child's fate and transform the murder into a protective act. As the novel progresses, Setha is haunted both by the angry spirit of her daughter and by the memories of everything else slavery took from her. Here, we see those influential forces at work, and we've shown off our ability to understand the complicated nature of the human experience, which again allows us to access those big ideas that reveal the deeper meaning of a story. Ideas in this case, like the parameters of maternal instinct, the consequences of injustice, and the question of whether or not ethics can even exist in a corrupted moral system. It's impossible to sit down and write an amazing essay about literature without first thinking about it. Before you hit the keys, go back to the text and fish out the small moments, the complicated moments in the story. Line them up in your mind, practice insight, acknowledge complexity, arrive at some big ideas. Before you know it, the deeper meaning will be close at hand.
All right, so that video provided a quick overview of how to get started on literary analysis, along with how to find those deeper meanings in the text. So that brings me to a short summary of the video, which is practicing insight and acknowledging complexity will lead to sophisticated analysis. The purpose of a literary analysis essay is to carefully examine a work of literature or an aspect of a work of literature. So, like in the video, it's mentioned that um, they're not analyzing the entire book of Beloved. They're analyzing the relationship of Setha and her daughter. So that would act as an aspect of a work of literature. So again, you're choosing something specific that you'd like to analyze within that text. Another thing is that with any analysis, you're supposed to, like I said, break the subject down into smaller pieces. Examining these different elements of a piece of literature, it's meant to help you better understand the work of literature as a whole and on a deeper level. So you're doing this for your reader so that they can get the deeper meaning of whatever um, about that text. And again, a text can have multiple deeper meanings depending on how you choose to analyze it. So, before you start writing, you do have to close read. This is a technique you've probably heard of before, but when you close read a text, you're looking at the meanings of words, the meanings of certain scenes and certain symbols. You're really reading the text closely to uncover deeper meaning. So, these are some things that you can do while you're close reading. So the first is to identify patterns of repetition. Are there scenes, images, or objects repeated throughout the text? Do they mean the same thing each time they're repeated, or do the meanings differ? If you notice scenes, images, or objects being repeated throughout the text, you might ask yourself what the deeper meaning of these things might be. Repeated imagery can be anything from multiple scenes of train travel to repeated use of colors to repeated phrases by a character. Analyzing those things might lead you to something that you'd like to analyze more closely. You also want to analyze and reflect on unexpected developments. Is there an abrupt or unexpected shifts in the text? Now, this can be in the scenery, this can be in character development. Is there anything that sticks out to you? So, for example, if you notice there's a transition from a fair city to a dead city, you might want to ask how the speaker went from a fair place to a dead place. Looking more closely at how that transition happens might uncover something deeper for you to analyze. Another thing to do is to consider historical context. As you read, consider how the historical context might be informing the text. So, for example, in the case of Beloved, the narrator in the video we just watched states that it's important to consider slavery at the time because it reveals a deeper meaning when analyzing the text because it's important to analyze the historical context of when the story of the time period the story is written in. So it's important for literary analysis as it might reveal specific critiques of the time that you can analyze further in your essay. So these are some things that you can do when you're close reading so that it can hopefully lead you to something you'd like to analyze a bit closer in your essay. So this brings us to our first activity, which is a literary analysis topic brainstorm. Uh, Now, if you're currently working on an essay for a class, this workshop is great for that because we are going to be doing activities that allow you to create material that you can then use for your essay. So, for this specific activity, you're going to begin by identifying the work of literature you're writing about. So there's a space on the worksheet that lets you put the title of what it is you're analyzing. If you're analyzing multiple works, please put that title on the worksheet. After that, consider what you'd like to analyze from the text. Some questions you can ask yourself as you consider what to analyze are there any symbols that stood out to you? Was there any unexpected scenes that you could more deeply analyze? Do relationships between characters speak to a deeper message about the human condition? Again, you don't need to answer all of these questions. These are just questions to get you started on thinking about what you'd like to focus on in the text. So just go ahead and write down some thoughts. You can think of it as a free write. Just write down any thoughts you might have in terms of what you'd like to analyze further in the text. So go ahead and pause here and continue once you're done doing that. Okay, so we're going to move on. Again, keep pausing if you're still working on that brainstorm, but hopefully you can use this brainstorm to eventually lead you to an argument, or in this case, a thesis statement for your paper. So now I want to review the different elements of a strong literary analysis. As I go through these elements, you might notice that a lot of these are aspects of just a strong essay. I'm going to try to specify it specifically for literary analysis and why these things might differ in a literary analysis essay from, say, an essay um, not about literature. So the first thing is your title. So the title is at the top of your page. It should be descriptive and it should go beyond using only the title of the literary work. So usually you're going to write your title after you've written your essay because it's going to give you a clearer idea of of where you took your argument. And chances are your title will be stronger if you save it uh, for the end. With your title, you want to try to draw the reader in. It should be an interesting title, but it should also let your reader know what your essay will be about. So the example here reads Theme in The Secret Lion, the struggle of adolescence. So it's a title that tells me the title of the work along with the fact that they're going to be analyzing the theme. And I know that that theme has to do with adolescence. So just from the title, I can understand what the essay is about. That's essentially what you want to strive for when you write your own title. You want to name the work and or the author uh, and what you're actually analyzing in your essay. The colon is actually a very popular way to create titles. So on one side of the colon, you could put the name of the author and the title of the work. And then at the other side of the colon, you can put whatever the topic is. So consider that when you are writing a title, make sure it's descriptive and it gives your reader an idea of what you're going to be talking about. The next is the thesis, which is a requirement for all essays. But for a thesis, for literary analysis, it should be complex enough to not be obvious to a casual reader, but it also has to be simple enough that it can be stated in a relatively short amount of space. So one example is the imagery in Dylan Thomas's poem Fernhill reveals the ambiguity of humans' relationship with nature. That's an argumentative, analytical title. It names the work. And it also tells me the deeper meaning of the work. In this case, it's revealing the ambiguity of human relationships uh, with nature. So it's a very clear thesis, and it tells me as a reader what direction the essay is going in. Some questions you can ask yourself as you draft your thesis is: how does the author's or narrative's perspective on a given theme shift as the text develops? Are there any tensions or contradictions within the text? If so, how might they be resolved? You can ask yourself: how does the text engage with the major political or cultural ideas or the era in which it was written? You can ask: how does the text challenge or undermine dominant conventions in the genre? Um, you can ask yourselves all sorts of questions as long as it revolves around uncovering a deeper meaning in the text. Remember, your thesis should reveal something that isn't super obvious. It should be something that you have to parse out by looking at the evidence and closely reading the text. The third thing you need is an introduction. So you need to include the title of the work and the name of the author in the introduction. You also want to try to capture your reader's interest. You can also include background information that's relevant to your thesis. So, for example, if you're writing an essay that relies heavily on historical context, if your analysis relies heavily on that, you might want to provide some historical context in the introduction. So, provide any information that's relevant for your reader to understand your argument, um, and for your reader to also understand the position that you're taking on the topic. So, those are the first three things you want to consider including when writing your literary analysis. The other two things are one, body paragraphs and topic sentences. All paragraphs should support your thesis statement. That's a given. It should also contain an explanation and of your ideas and evidence from the text. So, topic sentences should also provide an assertion of how that topic supports your thesis. So, to back up a little bit, textual evidence is key to a body paragraph, and textual evidence can come from, direct uh, paraphrase, or I'm sorry, textual evidence can be paraphrases, direct quotations, and sometimes even summary. When you provide that textual evidence in your body paragraph, you want to make sure you're explaining the significance of any textual evidence you provide. Why are you providing this textual evidence? How does it further prove your thesis? Um, you really want to consider that whenever you're picking out evidence to include. On the other hand, your topic sentence should connect the details of the paragraph to your thesis and tie the details of the paragraph together. So when I read your topic sentence, I should know how this paragraph is further proving your argument. I should also get an idea of what the paragraph's going to focus on. So a strong topic sentence is essential for this type of essay. Um, Again, in a body paragraph, you want to make sure you have a strong topic sentence and textual evidence with analysis that explains how it connects to and supports your thesis. Lastly, you also want to include a conclusion. Your concluding paragraph can restate the thesis in different words, it can summarize the points you have made, or it can make a comment on the work you're analyzing. The main thing is you do not want to introduce any new ideas or quotes in the conclusion. All of that should be saved for your body paragraphs. Now, I mentioned textual evidence, right? So, like I said, in a body paragraph, you need to include textual evidence, especially for a literary analysis essay. So, what is textual evidence? What sorts of textual evidence can you include in a literary analysis essay? The first is a paraphrase. So, a paraphrase is when you want to use that when you need the details of the original, but you don't need all the words from the original quote. So if you're not closely reading those words for your for your reader. If there's nothing specific in that quote that you need, you can opt for a paraphrase. Um, on the other hand, you also want to consider using specific detail. Specific detail is when you point to the details from the text to add concrete support to the development of your thesis. These details add credibility to the point that you're developing. So, specific detail goes beyond a paraphrase because it points to a specific word or phrase that's used in the text. It's not a whole quotation. It might just highlight a certain word. So, for example, if you want to point to a word that is commonly used often in the text, you could say the author refers to the electric eye throughout the novel. And you would put electric eye, which is the specific detail I'm referring to, in quotations in your sentence. Um, that is one way that you can incorporate textual evidence. The last way, of course, is the most known, which is direct quotations. Quotations can illuminate and support the ideas you're trying to develop. Effective use of quoted material will make your points clearer and more convincing. Emphasis on effective use. So again, if you don't need a whole quotation, if you're not analyzing parts of that quotation, then opt for specific detail or paraphrase. All three of these, you need to make sure you're adding a parenthetical citation at the end. Um, you need to make sure you're citing the page number and the author who said the quote every time. And I'll show you an example of what that looks like in a bit. With all textual evidence, you just want to make sure you explain how that evidence is relevant. Let your reader know why the quotes you cite are significant to your argument. Effectively using textual evidence like summary or paraphrase, specific details, and direct quotations. Doing this can illustrate and support the ideas you're developing in your essay. Uh, However, textual evidence should be used only when it relates directly to your topic. So, you shouldn't quote just to quote, essentially. You want to make sure you're quoting when it adds to your argument or when there's a specific thing you need to refer to. Because correct and effective use of evidence is important for a successful literary analysis essay. So, like I said, punctuating direct quotations might be a little bit tricky. So, I want to give you an idea of how to do that since adding quotations to a literary analysis essay is necessary. Again, you can always opt for direct quotation or specific detail or even summary in some of your paragraphs, but chances are you will need to have quotes in your literary analysis essay because you're analyzing those quotes. So, the first way to punctuate a direct quotation is to place the periods and commas inside the quotation marks. So, if you're quoting, um, for example, if you're quoting a something within your sentence, so for example, according to the narrator of The Secret Lion, change was like a lion, meaning that its onset is sudden and ferocious. So make sure you're placing the comma inside the quotation marks. This comma wasn't there originally, but the author added it because, or the person that wrote this sentence added it because it makes sense grammatically. So make sure you're adding those periods and commas inside quotation marks. So whenever you get to the end of a quotation and you want, and it's the end of your sentence, you would also put the period inside the quotation mark, not outside of it. So that's rule number one. Second thing is when you need to include a parenthetical reference to a page or line numbers, which you will if you're doing MLA format, you want to make sure you place the periods and commas after the reference. So, for example, the narrator of The Secret Lion says that the change was like a lion. So notice how the parenthetical reference is right here, and then the period is outside of that. Um, Again, you wouldn't put the period here if you have the parenthetical right here. It would go outside of the parenthetical. So keep that in mind as well. The third thing is punctuation marks other than periods and commas, such as question marks, exclamation marks, and so on, are placed outside the quotation marks unless they are part of the quoted material. So if you notice with this example, this is one where it's not part of the original. So why does the narrator of the secret lion say that the change was like a lion? Question mark. So because this question mark was not part of the original, it goes outside the quotation marks. So this might get confusing, but periods go in commas go inside, but anything that's not a period and comma, like a uh, question mark or an exclamation mark, goes outside the quotation marks. Here's an example with the exclamation mark part of the original. So the Duke shows his indignation that the Duchess could like everyone and everything when he says, "Sir, 'twas all one." So notice here that the exclamation mark is inside the quotation marks, and the reason why is because it's part of the original quote. So again, you would only add a question mark or an exclamation mark inside the quotation marks if it's a part of the original quoted material. Lastly, when the original material you are quoting already has quotation marks, you must use single quotation marks within the double quotation marks. So, for example, Lengo tries to stop Sammy from quitting by saying, "Sammy, you don't want to do this to your mom and dad." So, this is missing it. Okay, so instead of this comma here, it should be a single quotation mark. So let me see. Okay, so if you see here, I fixed it. There is a quotation mark, and then there's a single quotation mark, and then a single quotation mark and a quotation mark. So it looks like there's three, uh, but there are actually a double and a single and a double. So if you're quoting something that previously had quotation marks, you need to replace those quotation marks with a single quotation mark, like it shows in this example. So these are all the ways to quote grammatically. Hopefully that helps you when you add quotes to your essay. Okay, so for this activity, you're going to practice incorporating textual evidence. For this activity, I'd like you to choose a piece of textual evidence that is interesting to you. So if there's something that's stuck out while you've been reading, if there's something you've highlighted, if there's something related to a possible topic you'd like to write about, please choose that piece of evidence. Please then identify what sort of evidence it is. So if you want to practice using a paraphrase, a specific detail, or direct quotation, please specify that on the worksheet. After that, please draft a sentence that includes a signal phrase and the textual evidence. So just to recap, a signal phrase is a part where you um, introduce the info to your reader. So in this slide, this would be the signal phrase. The narrator of The Secret Lion says that the change was like a lion. You want to avoid just dropping in a quote. So when you practice drafting your sentence, please make sure you're adding a signal phrase and you're introducing your point or what you're talking about in this sentence to your reader. So here's another one. According to the narrator of The Secret Lion, change was like a lion. Again, the signal phrase is right here. According to the narrator of The Secret Lion. Just make sure you're introducing the quote or the paraphrase or the specific detail to your reader before you drop it in. So you're just going to practice drafting a grammatically correct piece of textual evidence. And remember to properly cite your evidence as well. If you're writing this paper for an English class, it's important that you're using MLA format. And MLA format generally requires that you use the author's last name and the page number in the parenthetical. So please look at these quotes. They're good uh, examples if you'd like to use a specific detail, or if you'd like to provide a whole quote, direct quotation. You can use these examples to build out your draft of one. So go ahead and do that on your worksheet. And once you're done, please continue with the video. All right. So here are some final tips for literary analysis. The first is to avoid plot summary. So, mention plot details that are relevant to your argument. Again, you don't need to give your reader a full rundown of what happened in the novel or the poem or whatever it is that you're writing about. You just want to focus on the details that are connected to your argument. You also want to opt for analysis instead of evaluative judgments. So that means focus on analyzing the work, not celebrating it. So what that means is you don't want to talk about how great the work is, right? You're not providing a review of the book or the poem or whatever it is you're writing about. You're analyzing it and you're revealing a deeper meaning for your reader. You also want to avoid confusing the author with the speaker. So remember that the person doing the writing may be different from the narrator, even if the narrator is unnamed. What that means is, I think sometimes when we write about an author who is writing in first person, we assume, especially with poetry, that the author is also the speaker. Now, that's not the case because with a creative work or fiction, the writer does not need to be the narrator, especially in poetry. It could be anyone. So, whenever you're referring to something that was said in the text, um, make sure you're not saying that it's the author that is saying it. So, for example, you would name the character if it's a character that's saying the quotation, or you could say the author writes something, but you don't want to say the author is a person that is expressing the quotation. Um, you don't want to mix the two up. Yeah, make sure you keep them separate within your analysis. So those are my final tips. These are the sources that I used to create this presentation, and they're also sources that you can use if you want to get into more detail about writing the essays. So I'm going to drop these links in the chat. So, or I'm sorry, not in the chat. I'm going to be dropping them in the transcript so that you can easily copy and paste them if you'd like to get more details on how to write a literary analysis. Thank you for attending this workshop. We hope to see you at the next Writing Support Center workshop.